Mr. Rector, Mr. President of the Association, members of the Academic Council, colleagues, students, special guests.
Señora Rectora, señor Presidente de la Fundación, miembros del Consejo Académico, queridos colegas, estudiantes, invitados especiales.
And a lot of my friends. In this place we breathe a lot of freedom and the privilege of having two glossy. Professor Huerta de Soto and Professor Alberto Venegas, my children, my intellectual mentors, even when I have not been part of their souls. I don't know if you notice, yes. It is for me a great honor to pronounce these words of recognition to whom today I receive the maximum title that this House of High Studies can afford. The doctorate honoris causa decides was granted to the doctor by Professor Huerta de Soto. With this distinction, we not only honor an exceptional academic, we also recognize a brave thinker, a generous teacher, and an unwavering defender of the values that sustain freedom, human dignity, and the spontaneous order of social life. Born in Madrid in 1956, Dr. Huerta de Soto is a PhD in economic sciences and a PhD in law at the Confucian University, economist, lawyer, actor, and magistrate in business administration at the University of Jaffa, where she took a course of study directed by the Commander of Spain, and her rigorous technical formation is combined with a philosophical and humanistic view that she has shared a central figure of the Austrian School of Economics at a global level, specialist of political economics at the Rey Juan Carlos University in Madrid. She has been the founder and director of the Master's Degree in Economics at the Austrian School, a unique program in the world with its profundity and conciseness. Her weekly seminar gathers students of degrees, co-graduates and professionals from all continents, consolidating a space of live debate, international and cultural. Intellectual production of Professor Huerta de Soto is vast and profound. The works produced in more than 20 languages are a reference force by liberal economic thinking. Among them she stands out in titles such as Socialism, Economic Calculation and Business Function. It was originally published in 1922. In this work, Huerta de Soto develops the theory of Kirchhoff's business function and synthesizes it with the criticisms of socialism formulated by Mises and Hay. Although one of her objectives is to integrate various theoretical currents around the possibility of economic calculation against socialism, Huerta de Soto expands the understanding of the business phenomenon to focus on the process of creation of knowledge. It is a rigorous, multidisciplinary and definitive criticism of socialism as a political and ethical economic system. This is the first book I read of Professor Huerta de Soto. I remember that back in 2014, when I was 13 or 14, it was still my class. And because of these issues of life, material began to arrive from Facebook. A video of Professor Huerta de Soto. We said that she could listen to her classes. For example, or the video itself about socialism, which is wonderful and much of it is contained in this wonderful work. I also got off from a place. I even got off from. It seemed to me a fascinating work, a work that has truly enlightened me. About the impossibility of socialism and the refutation that socialism makes, both the static and dynamic arguments, which I think are wonderful. What else? The oxymoron, which is the fourth point. The best thing that happened to socialism was when people escaped from the controls and could achieve that the system worked. If they tried to exercise control, things would get worse. And the best thing they could do was not do anything. So that's what happened. The mother of all bums, as Professor Huerta de Soto called it in the video, or the fundamental role of the price system, complicated with enormous clarity, the subjective and objective issue in the crop, the price issue, the role of prices as an information transmission system, as a mechanism of coordination and adjustment. The truth is that it was an impressive work. With the dynamic work of Professor Huerta de Soto, explaining with the money goats in the book, and we can basically explain how socialism destroys everything, and how it blocks the business function, and how it blocks the process of development, and that's what ends up sinking the economy. But that was not the case. Once I got to that work, then I came across another work. The interesting thing is that I came across them chronologically and adequately. So the work of the spontaneous works in a fabulous way. The work that is money, credit, Bacchus, and the economic centuries, published in 1998 in this book, which manifests a multidisciplinary approach. The author is a magnum opus, and the reader to a historical, theoretical analysis of the bank with a fractional reserve, by showing that the deposit side with a fractional reserve constitutes a legal abatement. Huerta de Soto passes the analysis of the economic century to fully develop a banking system that has allowed to create monetary substitutes of its own. The credit expansion of a bank with a fractional reserve leads to economic cycles. The most complete and developed work of the economic-centric theory of the economic cycle. It also offers a proposal to reform the current banking system with a fractional reserve in central bank, to make a banking system with a cash flow of 100%, monetary freedom and bank freedom. Can you imagine that here too? Well, this is a monumental work. It is a work that not only marked me on fire from the point of view academic, theoretical, but also in the same way as the previous book. It also marks a lot of action in politics. And I'm going to do it now. When the efficiency theory comes in the picture, I want to put the bases. I want to move the bases. It is a bit obsessive, very radioactive. Having said this, I go further. In all the discussion of the question of the deposit, of what it means, the deposit of itself, and as a consequence, the fractional reserve on the deposit is a real scam. So, but beyond that discussion, there is a whole part that is the discussion between the currency and the bank. Excuse me, the bank and the currency. I mean, and take this from the school of Salamanca and make a review of the whole debate. And I suggest it to you because it is a delight. It is a work of art. And it shows how the whole to be ends up converging and is synthesized, or in an incorrect way, in an 1844 law that creates the financial monster that we have today. It had positive elements of a currency score that say the relationship between the amount of money and the price level, something not, let's say, the school of Salamanca were the first to discover it, which is understandable, because the gold of America was traveling to Europe, so they found themselves having more gold, and things were now more expensive, but not less, because there was an effect of redistributing the wealth. Is not a minor issue, but beyond that. So the PNO basically wiped with convertibility into gold, but it had maintained the monstrosity, and became a hybrid. And that hybrid, we saw basically the history of crises. They're also quite clear how they work, because it always happened in the same way. The state taking money from the banks and then not paying them. Then people realized that the races were coming. Banks had to assist to avoid the problem in the short time. And the truth is, we had to work with a system of gold. And being a friend of a ministry was like being kicked out. And then what ended up happening was that later the convertibility violation was modified and the system continued. And clearly, for us, this is something very important. You can imagine that we were going to take this debate to the television. I have made a great effort to try to find more ideas, but let's say, if there are economists who do not understand the monetization modifier, imagine trying to explain to the general public how this works. Because the president of the central bank, Dr. Santiago Biziri, has interacted with Felipe Agus indirectly, with Professor Huerta. He has also done this with Juan Ramón Real, the counterposes to be able to make a synthesis. And why is this important? Because as a consequence, we have destroyed the currency of Aguizar, the research, the engineering, which is the real debt. As we are getting out of this situation so complicated that we had to inherit, because we combined the worst of the worst crises in Argentina. We had a surplus of money that we had in the previous Cotogaso. We had a situation in the central bank that was worse than the one before. The inflation of the funds in. We had 4 monetary bases, winning in one day funds. We also had worse social indicators than those there were in 2001. Therefore, all conditions were given so that if we, let's say, we had fallen into the trap of what I call libertarian liberals, we would have exploded by the air. I mean, in fact, if we had done this stupidity that Hans Jimmerhoff suggests, we would have exploded by the air, and today we would be the president of the country that lost the ballot. But before we would have had, in October, we would have been dead with the Paranism. We would not have doubted to throw ourselves in the street, so that already in January, we would have had all the bad, and we would have also burned the ideas. Therefore, we also had to solve a huge crisis, a European task that we took up. One of the team members, Dr. Petty, Hans, the days were very hard. We also had to deal with the death, and we also had to deal with the death. Now, don't open your mouth. Don't open your mouth. By also, let's say, point out in the geography, the Chinese. The crisis is also an opportunity, and as a consequence of this, we have a financial system very small. The credit of the real financial sector is 4% of the PIN. That is to say, it practically does not exist. Therefore, we have to rebuild it. And the best thing for this is to start rebuilding it on solid basis. That is why, let's say, we are increasing the deposits, let's say, on the deposit side, so that at the end of the road, we reach the 100% of the deposit. Not only that, but also already for the last quarter of last year, we beat the currency competition. Today, the Argentines can choose the currency they want. That is to say, you can make the transactions and the currency you want, because basically what we were predicting was a monetary strangulation, and to, let's say, avoid that, or let's go through the exchange market and make the exchange type fall at a faster speed than the one in which the real sector can be adapted and generate breaks. Then we allow people to use the dollars. They create a solid financial system that is consistent with the ethics of freedom, that respects the rights of property, and at the same time, we are also working on the monetary reform. This first part is going to be a whole legal framework that those guys who decide to remit money, there is no counterpart. And the consequence of this will be that they have to pay was jail. That is to say, but again, it is only a part and a long way until we can end was that house called central bank. We can send time because there are also adults who are inside our line who say no, Promptio is going to have time on the face day, or that Promptio is wrong. But that is politics. That is the bubble that politics entails. Therefore, we are working on that. We are also working. Luckily, the new president of BIMA is Flavio Sacorich. And in these days, we're going to have a meeting and we are going to be moving forward in how we are going to remove regulations, remove the state of the middle, remove the barriers so that the capital market in Argentina can begin to develop. We have noticed that those who like to have interest rates will have to nail that they have to pay, and that if it went wrong, they have to pay, and not the whole society, and thus dismantling the monsters of the capitalist system. The sidewalk that I want to point out, and now, today is particularly important, is that I am not going to tell you that here the storm is the door is Soto. So then we say, I am going to make it more synthetic, and I am going to develop this on Sunday. We say, I am going to return broken from Rome. I am going to arrive at 8. That one we say, we are going to be talking about these things in the Whitehall on Sunday. Basically, it is a theory of dynamic efficiency. The theory of dynamic efficiency was written in English in 2009, which is based on an introductory article of the same name, which appeared in the inaugural number of the magazine for Soto Macao in 2004. The door of Soto offers a novel and original definition of dynamic efficiency, the capacity of an institutional framework to promote the maximum entrepreneurial discovery, creativity, learning, and intertemporal coordination of individual plans. This is not done when the resources are ultimately given certain static data, but when it is allowed by the agents to discover and create new information in a decentralized and free way. This work is, for me at this moment, and given the challenge that Argentina faces today, it is one of the most important works to understand what we are doing. Without a doubt, we are carrying a successful stabilization. The major inflation of 54%. I always talk about the major, because basically I did not have to be competing the problems of relative prices and the aberrations that the treasurers made with the prices. And at 54% we are in a middle position, but the impact is still there, which means that a station that traveled at a rate of 17,000 per year today travels at 6% more. You are going to say 6% more. It happens that the theory works. There is nothing more practical than a good theory. Then, another thing they said is that, well, first of all, we were not going to be able to lower the station, and indeed we are doing. Then they said that what we were going to generate was, let's say, a new great pressure. As that from April began to realize that it was not going to be like that. They began to say that this is going to be with an airplane. We are going to have a tremendous fall, and from there, the economy is going to be dead. Therefore, in those two cases, it will be imagined that the levels of poverty would have been tremendously high. Let's say because, in fact, the very sincerity of the prices and the way in which the poverty in Argentina is measured, which is done in a celestial way. Therefore, even when it is well measured, we see the fact that we had a growing tendency to underestimate the true size of poverty, and also there were prices that were controlled, and the statistics did not show the scarcity, let's say, in some way. That is to say, he could be very rich in terms of the basket that was computed, but that when they went to the supermarket, they did not have them. So that number truly already existed. The 57% of poverty already existed. They said the only thing we did was share the prices, and today that number is below the 35%. That is to say, we low poverty in 6 months, or a year if you want, in 22 percentage points, taking out of poverty more than 10 million people. Well, for theory works. But not only that, because, well, there is going to be a smooth recovery. That is to say, the real wage increases will be very slow and socially unsustainable, given the traditional impatience of the Argentines. And yet, later they started to admit that they were the tip of the iceberg. Then they were the tip of the iceberg. Then they had no choice but to savor. It was a short ship. And today when we look at the numbers, we have a tilde. We are at the tenth of reaching the highest level of the historical being. As in me, if you allow me a poetic license, we are growing, and Argentina is going up like a bird of a feather, and you can see the bubbles. But this is not enough. It is not enough. It is not for us. Yesterday we had 500 days of government, and in 500 days we did 2,000 structural reforms for each day of government. We did 2,000 structural reforms. We are the most reformist government in all of Argentina's history. We achieved the fastest stabilization in Argentina's history, and we achieved the fastest recovery in Argentina's history. That is to say, the ideas work. And the other issue is the issue of economic growth, because now we are at the moment of grace. That is why the idea of the dynamic efficiency proposed by Professor Huerta Soto is so important. The first part of the work is to propose a historical review of the concept of optimal palette. Those who have listened to my talks know that I deeply despise that concept. And basically, what the palette is about is how we move along the border of the possibility of production, and if it is better to be inside of the same, and how to go to the border, and how are the movements there, and how to discuss at what point. And there clearly, Professor Soto makes an excellent point. In my case, about efficiency is independent at the distribution, but it is truly amazing because that makes the politician believe that the point of tangency is in one place and he can start to harass and steal someone to give to another, and we already know an experience. And the second point that I approach Professor Soto that I find wonderful is directly in the dynamic question, and the approach that Professor Soto makes is actually the dynamic efficiency is to allow the process of discovery to rise. And even if people have that incentive to create, to invent, to discover, then that is what moves to the border of possibilities of production, the expansion, in the end. And then the central axis is in looking for the mechanisms for that to be as strong as possible. And let's say an idea is only a poetic license to explain it. Just believe me, I'm just a little boy as an idea to find the optimal growth. But the most wonderful thing of this comes from the part that follows, is one that links it with ethics. There is a phrase that is wonderful. It says, efficiency are the two sides of the same coin. The self cannot be inefficient, and the efficient is always fair. This is from the Milei. This is from the Milei. I'm going to say, you could not know anything about economics, nothing, and you could achieve it if you work as fair men. That is to say, the fact of acting as fair, respecting life, freedom, private property, in the framework of the principle of non-aggression, the idea so present in the definition of liberalism. The great professor Vanik has said that I have repeated it, of the project based on the principle of non-aggression and in defense of the right to life, freedom and property. Believe me, there is everything. I have two witnesses and someone else from the cabinet. From now on, let's say Ernie, my 12 eyeglasses, but, and there we have. I'm going to give an example. Sim, before getting to politics, I have always considered that the SIPO was an aggravation, and an aggravation also tremendously violent, because it was not the loaning. They did not allow us to buy dollars, so to speak, because basically people did not have to buy dollars because they had green bills, and because in the background it is a paper. Then they had nothing in particular more than preserve and defend of expropriation. God, I saw the monetary policy of the state. Is he look, if they had stayed, they had in 2001, $1,000 or 1,000 pesos not only
Sí,
as
vaya que digamos,
people
la
are
gente
right,
tiene razón.
then
Entonces, en ese
in that
contexto,
context,
lo que
what basically
básicamente hace
prohibits buying dollars
comprar dólares
is
prohibir que
prohibiting that
ustedes
you
se
defend
defiendan
yourself
de la estafa,
from the staff,
con lo
with
cual
which
no
not
solo
only
termina
ends up
afectando
affecting
su
the
asignación
state,
intertemporal, sino que además
but
los puede mandar
also
a la quiebra.
the
Y
state,
consecuentemente ustedes empiezan a tomar
and
distintos tipos de
consequently,
medidas,
he begin to take
y mientras que el
different types
Estado
of
liquida
measures,
dinero para financiar
and
el
while the
fisco,
state
y
emitted
creyendo
money
que básicamente el
to
tipo de cambio
finance the
puede determinar
fiscal,
los precios,
and believing that
en realidad, digamos, la escala
basically
cambiaria
the
determina
type of
determinada
change
cantidad de dinero.
is what determines the prices, when in reality,
Entonces querían sostener
that
el
say
tipo
the
de cambio
nominal
hasta
scale
tratar
of
de
the
agarrar
economy
cantidad de reservas y cada
determines
vez
the
más
amount of
control.
money,
Y
and
la
the backside
contracara
of
ese
that control
control es que
is
ustedes
that you are
quedaban
left
con pesos
with money trapped
atrapados en el sistema del
in the
famoso
system of the
money
famous money organ,
o sobrante
or
monetario,
monetary sorted,
que no es ni
which
más
is
ni
neither more
menos
nor less
que
than
ampliar la base
expanding the
imponente
impenetrable
del
base
impuesto inflacionario.
of the inflationary tax,
Y
and we
nosotros
consider
consideramos que
that
los impuestos son
taxes
legales.
alone, and besides that
Y además
tax,
ese impuesto
is
además es un
also
impuesto
an
no legislado, o sea,
unregulated
ni
tax.
siquiera tolerable en
That
ninguna
is, it is not
democracia.
even tolerable in a democracy. In that context,
En ese
it is
contexto,
clear
está
that the
claro
sequel is in abatement.
que el cepo era una aberración.
It is clear that,
Está claro
due
que
to the
con el
disinterest
desastre que nos había dado
that
el
had
Estado
left
para
us the
comenzar
central
como no
bank,
podíamos hacer en el
we could not do it on the first day. That is why
Por eso,
we say we want
como
freedom
ganamos libertad
from the first
desde el
day,
primer día cortando
cutting 30% of public
público,
spending,
porque en el fondo,
because in
a
the
diferencia
end,
de otros ajustes,
and like other
fue
assets,
expansivo,
this was
porque la
expensive.
recomposición del equilibrio
The
fiscal
fiscal
no fue
system
subiendo impuestos,
did not
sino
raise
que fue
taxes,
recortando gastos.
but it was cutting expenses.
Y
And
ahí
there we
corregimos
corrected
5 puntos del
5
PBI,
points of the PBI.
corregimos
We
10
corrected
puntos
10
del
points of the
PBI,
PBI,
sanando el
healing the
balance del Banco
balance
Central,
of the central bank, but
pero
the
todavía
problems of stocks
persistían los problemas de
still
stocks.
persisted. And we had to get out of
Teníamos que
SIPO,
salir del cepo.
and we did.
Nosotros allá por
By August of
agosto
last
del
year,
año pasado,
and
y
seeing
los
the problems of monetary strangulation, and that people were not using the dollars to make transactions, we say it was clear that recomposing the balance of stocks was going to take a long time, and that would have implied that SIPO could not have been opened until December of this year. We say, but it was clear that next year SIPO could not be opened, and we would have reconstituted all the stock situation, but as a way to recompose and try to save this debt of the state with the Argentinians. And then the politicians for the Argentinians, they have stolen more than $150 billion in the last 23 years, the first 23 years of the 21st century. We did the reverse operation that was done in by South, and what we did was to go looking for that, to heal the balance of the central bank in a context where we also have a tax balance, therefore we are solvent, and we could pay the debt that we already had from the creditor. We are giving back to all the Argentinians, fairly, to those pesos that they have. That is, the scam is over, and given that, our calculations said that we needed $12 billion cash to be able to get out. Then I said that if they gave me $15 billion out, and I started to say it publicly, and we get a program of, if you take it well, it's $41 billion, because it's $20 billion from the fund, 12 billion from the bank, 10 billion from the BIM, 2 billion from a BIPA, and 5 billion for the renovation of the Chinese stock. And then they said, no, but in an electoral month, because it's going to float, and it's going to hit the prices, and I don't know how many things, and my commitment with society was that if I had $15 billion a day, and now of this 41 billion, I was receiving 20 billion cash. Therefore, I always said what I thought, and I ended up doing what I said I was going to do, and I opened it, saying that I didn't have to open it because I don't care about the logic of politics. What I care about is to give freedom back to the Argentinians, and that's the no. If one is guided by the ethical principles, that's going to be efficient, and that's going to generate growth. Obviously, with all the stadiums that are here, he won't understand it, but we are going to illuminate, and this house of study can do a lot for you. I have 3 more. I'm going to finish by committing the sacrilege of taking from you. I apologize. There is a wonderful contribution, that is liberalism vs anarcho-capitalism. You don't know how hard it is to live with that. You have no idea. But the important thing is to know where we want to go. Real life has state restrictions. Life is what it is. And there are other kinds of restrictions. When all the restrictions that we can raise, we raise them out, and we do it at a record speed. Our model of the motosierra. Today, this is a world emblem. Let's say there's a part of the motosierra that the minister has right here. There is another part of the motosierra that the minister has. In fact, today, let's say the Minister Kirchner has been incorporated as an advisor at the International Monetary Fund, and everyone is copying the motosierra model. They like more to copy the model of the motosierra Federico than the one of you, because the model of the motosierra Federico allows to remove regulations, but that is very difficult. The one he was on the other side of the seat. Stop. They this with the dirty fingers. But let's say there is also the part of the motosierra of everything, which is the one that carried out the cut of public spending in 30%. And let's say the budget of the central bank, Pontebaxo in Freno, this does a warning. Let's say the 3 guys who are already, and I'm going to tell you something, because this also, the ministers have great responsibility. I remember that we were in the middle of the storm, and I'm taking part of the speech. I understand the examples, and I'm going to take part of the speech. And then everyone had to go to a meeting. Everyone had to go to a meeting, to another meeting. Then when everything goes, when I'm with all the ministers, I tell them, well, we have this effort that we are making is enormous. And what I ask them is that accompany with an effort. They say we are already in superrain. Then I asked all the ministers to lower the spending 10% more. We're already in equilibrium. Then I picked, I redid the bat. And in front of there, let's say we did the bit. Guess what happened next week? They all came with a PowerPoint showing me where they were going to cut 10% more. That is, since we assumed we have lowered 16 taxes. We have eliminated taxes. Therefore, we are also taking the oppressive foot of the head to the people. We are becoming more and more free, and as we continue to grow, we will continue to lower taxes. Returning to the discussion, Professor Huerta de Soto has directed more than 40 doctoral theses, published dozens of articles as editor of the Castilian version of the complete works of Cal, and director of the magazine Proceso de Mercado, has contributed to preserve and perfectly define the Iberian tradition in the academic's view. His trajectory has been internationally recognized, has received awards, such as the Ria Giancarlo's Award for Economy, the Adam Smith Award, the Medal of Achievement of the National Work in Cavalier, the Cal Medal in Alemania, and several doctorates in Russia, and now with Police Pride. Beyond the titles, awards and awards, what distinguishes Dr. Huerta de Soto is his intellectual coherence and his moral courage, has defended with clarity and conviction the principles of individual freedom, private property, free market, respect to the legal order, and personal responsibility, even in times and spaces where those ideas were unpopular or marginal. The invitation to civic commitment, to critical reflection, and the construction of a society more just and proper. It seems that this distinction expresses the institutional identity of a free university open to debate, faithful to the academic rigor and the pluralism of ideas. To distinguish Dr. Huerta de Soto, the mission of this institution is also celebrated. To form leaders capable of thinking with themselves, to act with integrity, and to transform reality with solid foundations. I would like to thank Dr. Huerta de Soto for his presence, for his legacy, and for his example. And this honor and cause is a celebration of the ideas that unite us. Thank you very much. Thank you. Next, Mrs. Rector of the University of Sales, please give the doctorate. Please, Dr. Rector. Thank you. Professor Dr. Huerta de Soto promises to live with the fundamental values of the University of Sales, of freedom, integrity, excellence in practice, becoming an example of leadership, innovation and service to society. The doctorate and the Jude. Thank you. Dr. Huerta de Soto. Now we invite Dr. Huerta de Soto to give the speech. Mr. President of the Argentine nation, Dr. Rector, Dr. Rector, Dr. Rector, Dr. Rector, Dr. Rector, Dr. Rector, I thank you very much. As we have in Spain, academic, theoretical professors, friends of all Argentina, and especially Karina, and Alberto Rodriguez Lins, my old friend, with great humility, but at the same time with joy and enthusiasm, I thank you. Excited, this doctorate is not a cause that concerns the University of Science. I thank you very much, and I consider an undeserved and great honor the most loving words of Mr. President of the nation. He from the first moment, my dear friends, wanted to take care of my presentation this year, and I also want to express my happiness for being surrounded by so many and so many friends of Argentina, not only the present, but there are literally thousands of Argentines of all age and condition that especially over the last year and a half have expressed their ardent desire to visit them in a great country, and also they have done so with such fervor and enthusiasm that they immediately visit Argentina. For me to fulfill their desire and to be here today is the greatest of the civilizations and the greatest generosity, and it is that today Argentina has become a beacon of light and hope for the whole world. Without a doubt, the energy that imposes this light comes from the very president of the nation, who has assumed the titanic effort to advance the agenda of life and win the initiative of the cultural battle in all forms and political and social areas against the socialists of all parties, be they my left or my right. And as an academic and professor of economy at IM, as well as I was in Stellam, my colleague, the president of my law, today I would like to dedicate this speech to another cultural battle, equally important even if not known, and it is the one that is taking place in the field of economic science. And I would like all the present to be aware that what I am going to say is my testimony as an academic. I have wanted to synthesize in this presentation, in this lesson of 40 minutes of economy, everything that I can give as a synthesis of all my academic life. Therefore, I ask for your maximum attention, and to understand what I am going to say, we have to start from the emergence of the economy as younger science, and it has been a whole milestone in the history of humanity. For the first time, it has been discovered that voluntary social cooperation, free of all state coercion, generates a spontaneous order, not designed or organized by anyone, that drives prosperity and the advance of civilization. In addition to the economy, as a science of human action, it has been generalized in a whole variety of freedom, understood as the most essential attribute of the human nature. Freedom consists in that all human action and interaction is carried out voluntarily, that is, without coaction or organized external violence, and imposed from above by the always small group that with the title that is surrounded at every moment the exercise of violence that supposes all political power. The essence of this message and the sequence is deeply revolutionary in the history of humanity, subsequently led by the exercise of violence, whether of chiefs of tribes, pharaohs, absolute or constitutional kings, authoritarian or democratic republics, that is, by the states and their organized rulers that oppress and tyrannize their peoples. For the first time, it has been scientifically proven, that states, in any of their ways, were not necessary, that society understood as a process of voluntary human interactions does not need anyone to govern it, because it self-regulates, and organizes alone and spontaneously, and that the attempt to coordinate society in more co-active weeks of the state is impossible, and is therefore doomed to failure and to generate, as we see every day, all kinds of disarray, violence and conflicts. Economic science also dismounts and puts completely upside down the Renaissance tale story. Thomas Fogg and his acolytes, neither the state of nature was an ineludible situation and terrifying. They never existed, nor was necessary a supposed social agreement to create and maintain a state that puts order and guarantees peace. On the contrary, natural evolution consisted precisely in spontaneous emergence of trade and voluntary interactions, and unfortunately, appearing parallel to the state in the form of co-active and parasitic institutions composed of the most antisocial and violent states that desire to live at the expense of the production of the productive citizens, to whom they tyrannized and continue to tyrannize permanently, so that the economy, as a new science, proves that the so-called voluntary servitude is an anti-human aberration to which it has surely been subjected. This human being, that is economic science, opens the eyes to the human being, nor is it necessary to continue with the resigned custom of obeying the state, nor the governments enjoyed a halo of sacred prestige, but are literally naked of any attribute of intellectual superiority with Monero, nor the caste or Praetorian guard of intellectuals and superior experts, nor should we be allowed to buy, seduce, and deceive by the subsidies or sales with which the loyalty of the exploited human beings is desired, so that they consent to their situation of exploitation and servitude. A voluntary smoke. Economic science has reached its maximum degree of development of the hand of the Austrian school that we should call in the schools of the 18th century. This economic science is the work of the Austrian school that is based in the realism of its supposed analysis, in the dynamic approach of its analysis, based on the entrepreneurial capacity, creative and coordinator at every human being, and in the discovery and study of the self-regulated and spontaneous order of freedom in society. The result of this process that is not possible, no powerful, no culturally repulsed, the law in its material sense, and especially in the law of property, that although inserted in an inseparable embryonic way in human nature, arises outside the state and is discovered in a protective way, the family, as an imperceptible institution around which the advancement of humanity is made possible and consolidated, that act as the true automatic pilots of freedom, and that is internalized and transmitted from generation to generation, thanks to the families precisely, communities, and to the religion itself, the economic institutions, and especially the money that always emerges evolutively and to the margin of the state, and that can and should be considered as a social institution by excellence, because by allowing to overcome the problems of the money and the human interactions in which it is precisely discovered, neither perfidious nor perfectional, in the rest of the social, linguistic, moral, political, economic, and religious institutions. However, this essential message of economic science in favor of freedom so far has only achieved a very imperfect and limited impact on the inertia of a secular political reality characterized by the co-active power of the state and by the more or less resigned servitude of the governors. In fact, that as much as only materialized in a series of the pro-revolutions, divided with such ingenuity and arrogance as lack of success, to the impossible goal of trying to separate and limit the powers of states and governors to political constitutions and democracies, supposedly liberal. And it is true that humanity has been driven as ever in the places and historical moments where it has managed to free itself partially of the state and open some of the new channels of freedom that indicated the teachings of the economy For example, starting with the Industrial Revolution, which was not a first chapter of the never-ending revolution of freedom, driven by the economy, and although it seems relatively much, and in fact it is, what has reached in terms of prosperity and level of life. By today, already 8,000 million human beings, we cannot even conceive the level of life and volume of population that could be achieved if humanity could take advantage of the maximum and completely eliminate the teachings of our science. As Hayek says, we can be few and poor in a context of servitude and submission to the state, or many and rich in the context of freedom, the new land. I realized traveling for 13 hours to here is practically empty of human beings. The current population of the Earth is an extension equivalent to just over half of the Argentine territory, with a population density of museums, and we cannot even imagine the prosperity that could be achieved in a free market, daily protagonized by 80,000, then even 800,000 million human beings. And it is that the economist shows that the growing prosperity of an ever-increasing population never results from state plans, released and co-active, nor redistribution equal to sales, no increases in public spending, no subsidies, no debt, no much less of inflation, but prosperity only arises in the free market of a capitalist system. Capitalism is the process of voluntary exchange of all human beings that, endowed with an innate entrepreneurial and creative capacity, are able to detect and evaluate through the free price system the urgency and need of each day in service, investing the necessary labor and material resources to produce them, this overcoming their relative scarcity and satisfying each day, and in the best human way possible, the desires and needs, the thousands of millions of consumers, the businessmen that succeed in this process, a search for benefits that never runs out, accumulate important resources that in turn are saved and invested in capital goods and new technologies that make human beings increasingly productive, promoting their salaries and living a life, especially of the most numerous, a process of growing prosperity and increasing the population that I have called of Big Bang, social and entrepreneurial, and that if the state does not intervene, it will never be taken away, and that therefore it has no limits. Therefore, this crucial importance for humanity that is able to make the most of this essential teaching in favor of human freedom that the economy provides us. But for this, it is necessary to unmask what other powerful forces of the cedar scientific and counter-revolutionary reaction that have been mobilized to prevent the advance of the theory of freedom that the community provides. All of them have the same goal, trying to justify and maintain at all costs the state coaction with the scientific support appearance and prevent the full reunification of human rights, of human beings, and prevent the full culmination of the teachings of economic science after the freedom of human beings. We are now going to highlight and comment the main pseudo-scientific reactionary currents that are favored against the economy that constitute, in Hayek's terminology, the counter-revolution of science, and that have infiltrated as a lethal virus. In the first place, the positivism and the scientism as cedar science. By scientism we must understand the indebted application of the method of natural sciences in the field of economic science, while natural sciences study their object of investigation as something external, measurable, and quantifiable. The economy studies the implications of the voluntary actions of human beings. This supposed empirical evidence only has, and in the best of cases, a superficial, partial, and always historically contingent data. The word is too much of what is seen, or better, of what is believed to have seen, but not of what is not seen. And in the worst of cases, The positivism supposes the implicit acceptance that human beings are an object of investigation, equally manipulable than the rest of the elements of the outside world, and thus a premise is introduced that it corresponds to the state and its political caste to diagnose all the problems and using coaction to make things better as they want to see them in their empirical photos, historically contingent, that these empirical photos hide and cannot take the underlying dynamic essence of voluntary actions, much less what spontaneously is already happening, to coordinate and solve the possible problems. Therefore, it's not surprising that from the first steps of the economic science, driven by the Austrian school, its most violent opponents were the socialists of the class, grouped around the German Starko school, reinforced in French, literally the Mit-Kant and the Duken, who wanted to create a new alternative to social pseudoscience and its healthy positive influence, and the clinical plan continues to this day, first through the American institutionalism, and then with the massive compilation of the empirical data, such as those of Wesley Mitchell or those of Henry Schott. This latter that so much will end up in all of the German school. But abate this, I am going to debug myself by fate. In second place, we have the pseudoscience of the neoclassical economy, which says that it is only science, its own. There is the one based with an exclusive nature in the principles of equilibrium, maximization and constancy, in addition to the reality of its assumptions that has arisen to give an answer to needs of the natural sciences, but that does not allow to give entry to the subjective concept of time and to the entrepreneurial creativity that are inseparable from the human cruelty in freedom. The neoclassics developed their civil science not from the real flesh and bone human being, but from some similar types that are not a species of robotized penguins that even in their most sophisticated models of general equilibrium are limited to move and react to events and the coaction of the state as if they were the pockets of a kind of economic video game. But the neoclassical pseudoscience, despite its apparent sophistication, is unable to realize the immense complexity of the real world and reveals itself against the idea of the spontaneous order of the market. For 2 days, equally damaging to human freedom, on the one hand, inculcating the craft of social engineering as central banks, states and governors, to through fine-tuning, force and approximate the reality to the optimal mathematical of its models. On the other hand, and as Javier Monero says, qualified of market failures, everything that does not coincide with its phantasmagoric models of perfect balance and adjustment, that does not coincide with the models, is the reality in which it has to be wrong, but never wrong. Also observe, what do you want for this? How the neoclassical pseudoscience needs and feedbacks the empirical works of the previous pseudoscience, the positivists and neoclassics, allied and end up reinforcing each other in their reactionary agenda. This pseudoscience is one of the Keynesianism and macroeconomics in general, and it is that the macro approach already carries a status quo against the spontaneous order of the market and human freedom, as Javier said in his speech as he was in 1924. The macroeconomists ignore all that they cannot live and therefore do not take into account the economic processes and the really relevant theories, and at the same time they imagine that the macroeconomists have real existence, that although lack of economic sense, it seems that they can manipulate and isolate themselves to the treatment of this history. Again, look, the macroeconomic pseudoscience gives a hand to the positivist pseudoscience and to the neoclassics. In addition, the counter-revolutionary offensive of Keynesianism is especially harmful and perverse. There comes to mind that he talk a lot and such that God. Why is it especially perverse about Keynesianism? Because it denies frontally the coordinating capacity and of the export order of the markets, and also builds a static model, an alternative of equilibrium with permanent unemployment, with the objective of justifying all kinds of manipulations with tax and monetary assets. Again, the macroeconomic pseudoscience and Keynesianism is rejuvenated with a scientific focus of the neoclassic school, equilibrium, to the point that, for example, the so-called neoclassic Keynesian synthesis comes to become the main reactionary force within our discipline, as Heller wrote to us, or he wrote to me in a note. He says, referring to the model of equilibrium and macroeconomics, a science, that part of the presumption that it has information that it cannot have, is not a science. The Keynesians and macroeconomists have become the allies of that bogus statism, manipulation and political power that constitutes the framework orchestrated by central governments and banks, in which unfortunately we are forced to go that continually generates serious financial crises and social conflicts, and in fourth place we have left for the end the quasi-religious mysticism of the Marxist pseudoscience, because practically the Marxism scientifically died even before it was born. In fact, it was coetal and theoretically damaged by the subject of its revolution, that with the development of its capital theory and of the temporal preference since the beginning, evidenced the contradictions, scientific errors, and intellectual scam of the Marxism, and the idea about the impossibility of statism and a free market, free economy developed by the Austrian forces from the von Mises of 1920. He was a nail in the coffin that forever closed, the coffin of the Marxist pseudoscience. All this also is starkly illustrated by the fall of the extinct Soviet Union and practically the rest of the communist countries. Decades of indefinable human suffering for a large part of the world's population, apart from the 150 million that the Soviet Union, despite the certificate of its intellectual function and the major historical failure of Marxism, has returned to the charge with renewed vigor, an alternative cultural Marxism that has managed to introduce itself subjectively by scientists, including, of course, those of economic science itself. And here, we have to point out how the economy is literally invaded and corrupted by the cultural offensive, soaring the status of all kind. The parallelism with cultural Marxism cannot be more evident, because there is also part of a scientific and historical notoriety that nevertheless wants to be reverted by the way of the consumed facts, with the crushing repetition of slogans and the manipulation and control other means of teaching and communication, intellectuals and social leaders. As the well-known, the strategy of cultural Marxism avoids the direct confrontation, but in a way synonymous, slowly, little by little, of the basic principles of society, and the export order of the market is not denied directly the biological division of the sexes, but it is defended that in the last instance, sex is an intellectual construction that allows everyone to choose for his own. The traditional family is not attacked, but it is defended that it is only one more among multiple agreements of coexistence, all beings equally respected. Christianity is not attacked, but is considered that it is equally humanist and acceptable. Any other system of religious or moral beliefs, equality is not criticized before the law, but it insists that the important thing is equality of opportunities and above all of results. Freedom of expression is not denied, but it is praised and given preponderance to the public. About the private, wealth is not condemned per se, but it is repeated, and 1,000 times. These and other similar consignments can be converted, as the Nazis said, in official truths that become automatically accepted by the majority and to be part of the politically correct and therefore hegemonic ideology. Well, in parallel to this cultural Marxism, our science has consolidated a cultural staticism that begins from the moment in which the economy evidences how the processes of the human freedom vaccine promote such prosperity that they leave in evidence the statuses and political caste of all kinds that immediately and with great fear to lease the active power into the state of shock and dissociation, and it is precisely as a reaction to this dangerous reality for the political status quo, as they arise one by one in a scientific system that we have just commented. All of them share the same common denominator and try by all means reduce the revolutionary transcendence and to the scientific support, even by the economy, the human freedom, the free market, and try to justify at all costs the existence and enlargement of the state as an institutional cohesion organ, trying that human beings consider inevitable and with the support, in addition of the supposed and indisputable scientific consensus of a legion of academic experts that, of course, live in their majority at the expense of their own state. And so, within the empirical pseudoscience, we see how each part of social life is subjected to the most intense empirical scrutiny with the illusory purpose that can guide the cooperative intervention of the rulers. Every year, thousands and thousands of empirical research works are profitably financed and encouraged by governments, universities, institutions, and public and private foundations, giving jobs to thousands and thousands of economists that sadly end up believing that it is almost impossible to understand and predict what is going to happen in the real world, in human freedom, and in the united market. For them, as markets are not perfect, it is essential to the cooperative intervention of the governments to force reality towards the ideal and its models, deliberately go too far. I reject even to think that markets are human processes that are never in equilibrium and much less are perfect, so that still make possible by an intensity that cannot be reproduced by any state system and co-active adjustment. And there are a multitude of professional economists that seek to collaborate with the capitalist direction of the economy through fine-tuning, adjustment, and social engineering approach that reaches today its maximum degree of intervention and service of the citizen through the macroeconomic pseudoscience to stabilize financial stability and prosperity through the voluntary tax manipulation of the types of interest, the fashion to direct, order, regulate, spend, debunk, prohibit, and set prices, and above all types of interest, has become one of the most evident and tragic characteristics of modern economies. In this context, over and over again, are created in repeat to the act of intervention of central banks. Great evils were avoided, both after the Great Recession of 2008, by the way, caused by themselves, as the reason for the last pandemic, whose intervention generated from 2021 the most serious inflation pervaded in 40 years in the whole world. and none of them, and when the facts and Buttigieg, the most distinguished representatives of these pseudo-scientific currents, far from annihilating and humbly recognizing their mistakes and invitations, they rush to declare, for example, as Ben Bernanke did, in relation to the muscle used by the England Bank, that all those corresponding models were not sufficiently sophisticated, since, for example, the 500 variables in the model of the Federal Reserve were clearly insufficient, so it is necessary to believe much more. The number of variables and equations to get to discriminate and manipulate as it should be, with very complex reality, and although only a president of the European Central Bank, like Christine Lagarde, finally ended up recognizing that her main mistake was to believe in the predictions of the mathematical model. Our substitution of nothing, the sincerity attack, did not save the Europeans, because despite this, and still today, continues to aim to orient the monetary policy of the Eurozone to pass the evidence to imply that at the moment, and the models, now supposedly improved, because they continue to present the bureaucrats and officials headed by the great and brilliant economist, is really incredible, can only be understood, taking into account the institutional control that has come to support the pseudo-scientific cavaliers of the revolutionary reaction within the economic science. The vast majority of the economic departments are in certain universities that are of public titularity or receive a large public funding. Their teaching programs are decided by officials at the service of the state. Other universities with the primary goal to train experts in public intervention that promote the statistical agenda, and all the process of accreditation, selection, and promotion of the process is conditioned with us cultural staticism, as well as the most prestigious scientific magazines in which young teachers want to advance in their professional career, and the same sex is a pro-status can be found in the concession of subventions to research, national and international awards of economy, as well as in the economic agenda of public and institutional organizations. In short, the triumph of cultural staticism within the economic science is being clear and successful, and in fact it can be considered that the relative time that state is having, the culture of Marxism that state is having, is also being talked about before the libertarians. We must also make mention to the paper that in a cultural battle against staticism, they have economists, universities, and means of communication that, although they defend the freedom and economy of the market, we must qualify ourselves as useful innocents. The time is not yet used. It is the time of use for fools, but let's not be aggressive. Today I see here simply useful innocents in the terminology proposed by the masses of omnipotent I say the speakers, although they oppose staticism and defend freedom, however, to accept that they have been manipulated by the reactionary currents that we have described. They end up in a last instance, without wanting to, giving additional impulses to the status reaction within our discipline, and especially when they strive to advise the states so that they are more efficient and do a little better, things that they should not do in any way. So it could fall in this category of being a good friend with many contacts. It could fall in this category of useful innocence. A thinker is unquestionably liberal, as Sir Robert Popper, of open society and its enemies. He not only admires the scientific capacity and even the humanism of Karl Marx. But even worse, it ends up proposing as an alternative, a strategy of social engineering, workout act of social engineering, with the goal of being able to judge in each case, and based on its empirical results, whether it has been accepted or not. According to the co-active intervention of the state, another example of useful innocence could be that of George Stickler, when he came to manifest that only empirical evidence, that can make you think that the economic system, socialism or capitalism, could work the same, which means that you have to try them before you decide, with immense social cost. That sadly we know that kind of evidence can come to have one and another Karl Popper and George Stigler. Despite their sincere liberalism, they propose, as many others, that specialists in intervention and a social engineering, even if it is BISMI, NICO, and empirical studies that constitute the essence of the statistical currents, being scientific and reactionary, of our discipline, sorcerers, compared to those others that, for example, in the fields of biology and medicine, support the genetic manipulation of viruses initially, what euphemistically is called function gain, on the pretext of advancing science, but with the immense cost of technology. As it seems that it could have been very serious pandemics, and also often have fallen in this category of useful innocence in the war of the members. I name particular liberal economists as conspicuous as Jerry Packer or Milton Friedman. Becker defending methodological reductionism, considering that it is only economic science, the elaborated within the narrow limits of balance, constancy, and maximization. And even more disturbing could be considered the case of Milton Friedman, who is very sincere love for freedom and intense media support to the free markets, contrasts with its approach based on the pseudoscience of the macroeconomy in the aggregates of Keynesian origin, in the positivist empirism, and in the full acceptance of the unrealism of the supposed scientific recessions of Friedman, which in its own way had ended in a last instance, reinforcing the stochastic interventionism. For example, when he left out of his mechanical theory the most important thing to know the distortion that inflation generates in the relative prices, or when the Austrian theory of psycho-capitalization to interventionism, or for example, when he concluded that the Great Depression of 1929 did not intervene enough, an argument used his basicity as justification, for example, by Ben Bernard himself and by many others, of the heterodox policies of the difficult monetary accuracy developed massively before and after the Great Recession of 2008 and later committed of the last pandemic, or as when Friedman initiated and promoted the introduction of the recessions to increase the regulatory efficiency of the North American fiscal system after the Second World War, or when the status was to appropriate the Friedmanian occurrence of the negative tax on the income to justify the implementation of a minimum social income that they loan in our country and the rest of the European Union in the context of the fight against poverty. And as far as the tank, as weak is the critical background of Friedman to Keynes in the last instance, it remains only in the arithmetic, empirical argument that consumption seems to behave as if it were a permanent function of the sale. But we have to ask, what would happen if this empirical demand of validity to the historically contingent sum of the Keynesian economy, whose approach and methodology by the way freedmen could again be rehabilitated. It seems by chance that the qualitative of innocent, useful to freedmen's monetarism, is more than purely justified, and also that Halleck was completely right when he stated that after Keynes' general theory, the book that has done most damage to the economic science has been the test. And it is that in the cultural battle against the status, this is an idea that the President has just mentioned. In the cultural battle against the status and the economic science, with this kind of liberal and useless friends, it seems that the defenders of the great message of the economy for freedom have already more than enough to face before starting the fight with their main enemies. On the other hand, it is that this same is going to kick me out. Okay. And within the field of journalists, he was saying, inside the field, and within the field of the journalists, and those that Halleck denominated second-hand dealers are nowadays, are also legions of useless innocents. For example, today perhaps, they are headed by the prestigious columnist of the Financial Times, Martin Wealth, who especially in the late part of his career does not stop justifying recipes of marked status character to solve all the economic problems of the world. Within the field of institutions, highlights the cases of important universities and private institutions that in the face of the fear of losing scientific respectability and being cut off from politically incorrect, do not hesitate to give up to the posthumous and what I can say to some simpans and many awards and academic diplomas are the ones that will always hurt on that hard and not wrong case. Fourth, I think in the activity of selection raters to the tyranny of thought, that in a century of political consensus. And now I'm going to end with some reflections on how to win the culture battle to the status. What I'm going to do is to put in place a design of what could be an effective strategy to reverse the painful state of our discipline and to successfully face the cultural status that they give us. In the first place, the long-time strategic goal is to continue investigating constantly and without rest all the implications of the spontaneous order of the market and the processes of creativity, and then all the effects of mismatched conflict and disordering that the statism generates at all the social plots in which it lies, and in the way it impacts on the monetary interaction. And this because all the intervention of the state is based on partial empirical observations, always obsolete and historically contingent. This morning to criticize the President that what happened with the statistics of consumption are empirical, contingent, partial, that only has the archaeological value, does not collect the processes that are spontaneously unleashing the self each problem, processes of coordination that when acting, the state coaction is blocked, so that the problems and mismatches, far from being solved, are even worse. As you can see, the field that the independent investigator is literally immense, because as economists, we can understand the truth of scientific truth without any kind of statistical exegesis, and here the leadership, as far as the investigator method, as in respect to the consolidation of the achievements already achieved and the new lines of research pending the combination, corresponds to the Austrian school of economics that from its foundation has fought against wind and tide and has never avoided any intellectual battle against statism, a science. Therefore, investigators should never fall in defeat, nor stay in our tower of ivory, watching as impassible witnesses to the daily aggression that in favor of statism develop the arrogant followers of the different reactionary currents. On the other hand, the economists must denounce continuously and without rest or any repair, without ever lowering the guard, disassembling the air, always wary to raise it, explaining its often serious consequences, and in some, putting in evidence in front of humanity to its responsible, and the set in the field of scientific ideas. Neither concessions are admitted, nor prisoners are made, and all this with a constant and tireless enthusiasm, vital attitude. As USA, we celebrated its anniversary with a video of it. We could describe it like this: it does not matter that they're giants or mills, when the pinnacle of our sire moves to the winds of tenacity and faith. Daniel had the honor of being invited to dinner to give silence to the friends for the presentation of the presentation, nothing expensive, but of great sentimental value, prepared by the Royal Spanish Academy of El Quijote. And I dedicate it precisely in this sentence, because if we have an idealized image, and what is a wandering horse rises from the sky to undo the knot and fight for freedom, that wandering horse is the President Javier Núñez. Thanks you. And although, obviously, none of us are free of sin, we should not fall into the mistake, even by Austrian economists, as Javier himself, and here he could also get closer, at least in the field of forms, to the category of the last innocent, to always consider intellectual adversaries may have been victims of a simple slip or scientific error. No, we have to go much further, denouncing always that it is necessary, the real social implications of the supposed simple error, and the reactionary origin and character and scientific error of the same, enough of knighted and concessions to the politically correct is the habit of economic science that is playing with humanity as to fall into this type of weaknesses that face the outside, with the risk of always being misinterpreted, and above all, to make the essential economic principles go unnoticed and be ignored as one they appear in a terrible way. How do you complain that it is ridiculous? And here we can. I know he will. I know he will. And make a ought to be. Pirates speak Spanish. Return again to our classics, and in particular to the great Francisco de Paras, that to enhance the courage that has to characterize us in the search for scientific truth. He said the following: I must not be silent, no matter how much with the finger, already touching the mouth with the forehead. Silence once so threatens me. There is no brave spirit. Always know how to feel what is said. Never know how to say what you feel. The day, without fear that the free scandalizes, can speak the ingenious, showed that greater power he fears. Another fundamental principle is to introduce us within the institutional status framework that dominates the economy, with the goal of mining and destroying it. Obviously, in the scientists, here the main risk is the temptation to make concessions, and admissible in scientific terms, to guarantee us a position and professional career that gives us scientific equity and versatility. By my personal experience, and that of many of my collaborators, among which the professors Miguel Angel Alonso and Felipe Bapestana, I will say that although it is very difficult, it is possible to climb within the system of governmental accreditations, forced publications in magazines, GCR, and departments of economics and universities, publicly funded, without traditionally any scientific and essential principle, and systematically leading from within the system, is possible reform and dismantling, and the scientific criticism itself, all which, by the way, is an illustration of more than how bad the state works, and how it always leaves open gaps between which we can introduce subjectively to destroy it. And in parallel, it is also essential to take advantage of all the tactical possibilities, other new technologies, Yesterday we talked about all the new technologies in field of the so-called artificial intelligence and of the communications, social networks, videos on YouTube, podcasts, courses of scientific economy, etc., that today are available and allowed to highlight, literally at the speed of light, all the statuses of the pseudo-scientific that literally infects our discipline with the serious social damage that it generates. In this area, we are really facing a total change of paradigm that is ending with the traditional statistical means that until now monopolized the scientific diffusion, and we conclude it is possible to drive the dismantling of the state with the teachings of economic science. This is the great challenge of our current science, to get rid of the reactionary counter-revolution that is committed to maintain and justify as it is the proactive, systematic and monopolistic power for states in governments, and open in a definitive way and forever all the social parcels to voluntary cooperation, anti-human and libertarian interaction, so that even justice, public order, the prevention, repression and sanction of the law this morning asked us be provided by market processes based on voluntary cooperation demonstrate that such a strategic objective not only is possible but also the only way to promote civilization and the unlimited growth of welfare and the number of human beings is the great challenge of our science, and this only will continue to advance if it culminates its great and original discovery of the creative and coordinative effects of the market process and the great damage, the institutional cohesion of the state, thus to humanity. In summary, the final triumph in the war that we are carrying out within economic science against the cultural status that is corrected today will only culminate with the full theoretical elaboration, first in complete practical explanation, after the libertarian ideal, the anarcho-capitalist system, that this ambitious scientific program comes to culminate will undoubtedly depend on that in the future humanity can expand exponentially with the prosperity at today. Because of its greatness and complexity, we cannot even imagine. Thank you very much. Thank you.